Hello, my friends. This is life coach Mike Trugman, and welcome to an episode of Mike's Search for Meaning. I'm after some big questions. Why are we here? What makes a fulfilling life? How can we grow individually and collectively? Each episode, I'll dive deep with leaders who are doing great work in the world and see how they organize their life. Books read, value systems, resources used, and stories that show how each of you can create the life and the world of your dreams. Hello, my friends, and welcome to episode 103 of the Mike's Search for Meaning podcast. My guest today is Michael Koehler, and a very important note about the timing of this conversation. This episode was recorded on August 3rd, 2023, which is about 2 months before the war in the Middle East began. And the reason that this is really important to note is because a large part of our conversation focuses on Michael being from Germany and what that means for him as a leader today, reconciling Germany's, of course, really terrible past with the Holocaust. And as Michael goes through what that means for him, reconciling his past being German and what that means for him as a leader today, the reason that we did not talk about the war with Israel and Hamas is because the recording happened before the war began. I think that's really important to note. Now, this conversation is a really deep exploration of exploring our individual and collective pain and trauma so that we don't let it unconsciously dictate our lives. And Michael really courageously and openly explores that in this conversation today. We also talk about how imperative it is for leaders to be able to navigate complexity, something that we don't get into too much, if at all, in this conversation today is technical versus adaptive challenges. And Michael, as the CEO of an organization called KONU, really helps organizations dig into adaptive challenges. Adaptive challenges require more complex thinking than if this, then that. And technical challenges are things that are typically worked on by, say, an engineer, right? Like an engineer or a surgeon. You want an engineer or a surgeon to be able to follow a set of guidelines and rules. And that's not the same thing as what's called from leaders today. Leaders, a lot of times, are dealing with challenges that do not have easy answers. They might not have answers at all. We have to sit with the challenge of that. Things like sexism, racism, these are really huge challenges that organizations and leaders are faced with today. And so Michael explores this as well as reconciling his past being German and now living in America, and how important it is for all of us to be looking at who we are, where we come from, how are we affected by the way we are raised, the country we were born in. All these things are so imperative to look at, and Michael gives us the gift of exploring that in real time on this conversation. So I'll let Michael take it from here. And with all that said, settle in, take a deep breath, and enjoy this conversation with Michael Koehler. All right, Michael, welcome to what today I guess will be Michael's search for meaning.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike.
Yeah. So there's so many different directions I want to go today. And something that seems important to both of us is to understand, reconcile our past, both individually and collectively. And I actually start every interview with the same question. It's an interesting portal into your personal past and will give us fertile ground for a lot of the rest of the conversation. And I would love to know, what was it like at your dinner table when you were growing up?
Trigger alert. So it was not easy at my dinner table. My parents, who got divorced after 40 years, when you ask them, what did you get divorced, they would say the last 40 years. And so so at our dinner table, there was often argument and tension between mom and dad, and I'm the younger kid. I have a 10-year older sister who kind of was only basically half of the time of my childhood from like 0 to 10. She lived at home with us, and then she was off for college, and I was by myself. And so most of the dinner table memories I have is actually me sitting in a triangle with my parents and kind of incompetently trying to make peace
Mm.
between those two adults who could not figure out how to like, be together. And so I was hard. Um,
Yeah.
and um, and at the same time, I think even though sort of the peace builder was not very successful at home, I think I learned very early on a skill there that is still relevant in my work today around like perspective taking and coaching and mediating and all
Mm.
of that stuff. And sometimes people ask me, when did you start this work? I would probably say at the dinner table,
Mm.
at home.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Michael, I share this quality with you. I felt like, well, I'm really grateful for my upbringing, but I also felt like the mediator of the family, that if there was conflict, that I took on the role of peacemaker, that it was my job to make sure the tension was brought down. And I've heard you speak to one byproduct of that for me was that I have this interesting is one way to put it. I have a challenging relationship with anger. And
Mm,
I've heard you speak to the same thing before,
mm.
that anger, maybe I would love to hear you talk about how you have internalized what anger is. I'd be happy to share on my ends too. And what it means to you to be in right relationship with anger. So I think in the leadership development space, anger is actually a really powerful vehicle and tool.
Mm. Now I'm curious about what your relationship is, but I'll give you the headline. Maybe we can sort of create this together. But um, so the headline I think is as a child, I don't think I have learned how to deal with anger productively, in the sense that I don't think there was much space for me to express my own anger or even my own needs in that context. There was just a lot of problem space already in my family of origin. And so um like I always like I think I grew up holding that assumption that like I can't add any further problems to the family system. So, that's where I created kind of this assumption around I need to perform well in school and I need to like be nice and all of that stuff. And so there was not much space for anger. And it really became difficult when I kind of, as an adult, realized how triggered I am around anger, around other people's anger, and how that even like kind of a fairly, I would say, non-threatening way of somebody being angry. Not talking about violence here, but just somebody saying like I'm angry, like how that used to trigger me or still sometimes does trigger me in ways that feel unsafe to me without that actually being unsafe. Um, that came home in my own marriage, when my husband shows anger. Um, but that also comes home when I'm dealing with, people in authority roles, or just in my, work relationships. And of course, the expression of my own anger, which I would say has been highly repressed to the point that I don't even notice that. And so some of the work that I've done recently, particularly when around the pandemic and the George Floyd and the subsequent kind of heightened around sort of race identity themes, um, were really kind of getting in touch more with my own triggers around anger, my own anger, ways of like, surfacing my anger, um, and feeling, allowing myself to experiment with versions of expressing anger, uh, and dealing with the worries that come up around like, oh my God, do I hurt people when I tell them I'm angry? Like this behavior makes me angry. Um, but then also like as a result, maybe become a little bit more comfortable with other people expressing their anger towards me. Um, and like it's been a very interesting healing journey, but I'm certainly still on that journey. But now I'm curious, how's this showing up for you?
Yeah. Well, in so many words, I learned that anger is bad. I wasn't I didn't grow up around healthy expressions of anger. And if you go back in my lineage of my parents' parents, anger was always a gnarly emotion. It was always unleashed in a way that it was probably repressed for a long time and then explosive and then repressed and explosive. And what I internalized at a young age when I saw that, I think I told myself, I am not going to do anger. Anger is really bad. And so, like you, I was probably walking around with so much repressed anger all the time, not knowing how to be with it or how to be with other people's anger either. And in studying this thing we call consciousness and leadership development, inner work, I've learned that every emotion is communicating something to us that's it's not good or bad.
Yeah.
So this continues to be a really big part of my journey too. Just understanding what healthy anger looks like, what healthy grief, sadness, fear, all of that looks like, because I, in many ways, have internalized that anything other than being pleasant to be around and being happy is not desirable. So yeah, as I evaluate my parents or my history, I'm in touch with especially the men in my family that anger was very, very in your face, and it would take up the energy of the room. And I think it's common for one person to either take that on themselves or to do the exact opposite. So I did the exact opposite. And like you, that has served me in a lot of ways as a peacemaker and someone who's able to mediate. And in other ways, I can really easily both lose my sense of self and also not be around other people when they're in a place of tension. So that's a little bit about my personal relationship
Yeah.
with anger.
Yeah. Yeah. And the boundaries is such a hard piece for me, right? I used to and sometimes still do like forget. I feel like anger can set in when the boundaries are violated, and I sometimes work myself to like exhaustion
Mhm.
because that anger that kicks in that says like, hey, this is enough. Like I don't even notice that or notice that far too late. So it's interesting. It's really interesting how what is served us in a way is like also getting in our way.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense on how this kid in you made that choice between like, you know, fight back versus like, oh no, I'm not gonna take this thing on, like that choice point that you're describing?
Mm. I mean, one thing that I think was also really prevalent for me was that I felt like I was rewarded if I was in air quotes perfect. Like
Yeah,
if I did what was expected of me, that generated a lot of praise. And so
mm,
it seemed like the easiest way for me to generate a lot of
yeah,
praise was to like if I'm asked to do a chore and I don't do it, I might get yelled at. But if I do the chore, then I am going to be celebrated for that. If I do my homework, if I do any of those things, it felt better for me to do what was expected of me and deal with my own consequences later than to do the opposite, like take a firm stand and say, I'm actually, I want to put a boundary up. Like this is, you're not expressing this in a clean way to me. So yeah, that was the best way for me to cope as a child was I wanted to be perfect. And I thought that there was a way that if I, it was in a weird way, it was manipulative. And my way of trying to control was that if I was perfect, then there wouldn't be any anger. And that's the best that the child in me could do. And he's a beautiful kid. And I've also learned that there's other, anger is not bad and that being perfect doesn't exist.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, there's so many places that I want to go, but I love in your podcast on the balcony. I think it's really a neat way to understand a little bit about who someone is through the different hats that we wear, different identities. So in if you were a guest on the balcony on your own podcast and you were checking in as we shift out of childhood and more just into who you are today and the hats that you wear, what would be the identities that you would show my audience right now? Like who's Michael?
Who is Michael? I a white German, gay man. Like I'm like, as I'm finding it, like selecting the identities here, like sort of, it's almost interesting, like the kind of, we can think about sort of the historically more sort of oppressor identities, like, white, male, German. I hope
Hmm.
we'll talk a little bit more about kind of German stuff later. But then also like kind of, I'm a gay man. I'm an immigrant. I identify as an immigrant in this country, in the US. I've moved here 11 years ago, come for grad school, met my husband, stayed. We decided to live here. I live in an interracial marriage. My in-laws are immigrated from Taiwan in the 80s. Um, and so I'm kind of sort of, in terms of social identity, I'm really holding kind of many of the boundaries that we're maneuvering in organizations and society kind of in a way within me. I come from a post-industrial town with a lot of unemployment, a lot of gray. That's like how people describe the town I grew up in Germany, kind of from kind of a middle to low class experience in terms of education and economic background, and the I think I have about a little over 30 cousins, and like there's two people who or three people who went to university, and two of them are my sister and me, right?
Hmm.
And everybody else is much more sort of working class. So it's kind of an interesting mix of identity intersections. And then there's the chosen identities of work identities. I identify as an entrepreneur, as a coach, as a facilitator, as a yogi. I've been
Hmm.
recently really intensified my yoga practice as a guitar beginner player, um, as a dancer. Dance was a big part in my life and in my past. Um, yeah, those are some of the identities. There's probably more, but those are the ones that are in the foreground right now.
Hmm. Hmm. And another one that you didn't mention that I think could be interesting is educator. I know that you're definitely an
Yes,
educator, right? And
yes,
I have a curiosity about where all these things emerged from, but I know something that was really important to you to talk about, and I think it's important for all of us to look at in our own life is reconciling our past. And you said you're from Germany, and Germany is one of the oppressor identities. And actually, I one of my identities is Jewish, and so in my recent studying of epigenetics, I know that the past doesn't just live in the past. I know that scarcity in a lot of ways is hardwired into me, right? That there's scarcity around food, scarcity around money, and I think that that's probably true for a lot of people who were in an oppressed group like
yeah,
Jews. And there's also a lot of trauma that comes from being in an oppressor. And if we don't look at our past and do the healing around that, it continues to kind of unconsciously run the script on our life.
Ah,
And
gosh.
so, like, thank you for taking the courageous look at this and for bringing this to me as something you wanted to talk about. And yeah, like, what would you say? What do you feel compelled to share about your German, not your German, your journey and Germany's journey?
Well, thanks for bringing this up, and like the way how we carry this stuff with us. I just want to name the moment you said, you identify as Jewish. Like, I just want to say, like, my own like heart rate went like just up by a beat, right? And it's so interesting how like in our sort of subconsciousness and bodies we are carrying, like, sort of, here we are at that intersection, German Jewish, in this podcast. I come with like, I want to talk about Germany's history and like how we're dealing with it, and like that moment, like, such an it's so interesting, like how much we are carrying that. And my sense is like, in a way, that happens very, very often when representatives of boundaries meeting with each other at the
Mhm.
workplace, and most of the time it's subconscious. Like most of the time it's glazed over, and like, okay, but my heartbeat, maybe I'm noticing, not even noticing my heart rate goes up a little bit, but like that stuff it's present with us, whichever boundary we're crossing. So I care a lot about this stuff, and I really think it's an interesting field, particularly as we're thinking about sort of um, you know current times in our world, and thinking about how to work across difference, how to heal the historic injustices we are representing in our world across many different dimensions, race and gender being two of them that are very present. There are others in many parts of the world, but those are the two that feel very present to me current kind of in my life. Um, Maybe also sexual orientation, which is something that is shows up for me in my life. Um, but I think what is interesting for me, and I'm just coming back from Germany, that's why it's so alive, and had a few American friends with me, and we did a little bit of a tour of Berlin, and it was really important for me to like show them around Berlin, and like talk about sort of the good and the bad and the ugly around how Germans have learned to deal with history and memorialize history. And we sort of went through some of the memorials and went also to some of the sites that are kind of not so good at memorialization, but a little bit more sort of the victor approaches to history, and all of that has been very interesting. And the reason it's been interesting for me because my sense is that these dimensions are worked very differently in the United States, that is also struggling with its really difficult history, in kind of the two big kind of the two big historical atrocities around the genocide of the Native Americans, and then the history around slavery and subsequent um, atrocities towards Black people and brown people in America. And and so like I feel like interested in kind of thinking through like some of the German history, particularly as it pertains to like working through the Holocaust, and working through like really dealing with that harsh part of our own history, and thinking through like sort of how does learning happen, and what can we learn from kind of different iterations and different cultures adjusting with things. And I think there's a couple of things that have worked well in Germany. There's a couple of things that aren't working well in Germany, that are just different than in the US. And I think that's really interesting to talk about. So, happy to dive into that more deeply, but also curious to hear what's coming out as I even try to frame up why
Right.
this is important to me, and why that is a topic that I'd love to bring to this conversation.
Yeah, well, when I wrap up, please do continue on. I would love to hear it. It brings up a couple of things for me. So one is I want to also acknowledge my oppressive identity. So I'm heterosexual, white, male, in addition to being Jewish. And so I'm deeply in touch with the level of privilege that I have, being in a white male heterosexual body as well, and the discomfort that you spoke to when I announced that I'm Jewish and you're German. In a lot of ways, I've probably hidden most of my life from when I pass, say, someone who is unhoused or is a person of color who is Black. There are all of these kind of unconscious scripts running through me that I intellectually have wanted to bypass. But I think it's really important for all of us to do our work around these really thorny challenges that we're confronted with as a society. So I want to name that. I think that it seems to be one of the most easily avoided pieces of inner work. And I know my mind can be really sneaky with saying I'm one of the good guys. It's happened a long time ago, but I think it's really important. And there's a story that's coming up for me. I mean, I think this is a beautiful demonstration of what might be possible in terms of if we take the look at the hard thing and do our healing, what's possible on the other side. I don't know if you're familiar with Raj Sisodia, but I recently had the opportunity to interview him on my podcast. He wrote a book called Awaken, and he was looking at, he comes from a patriarchal, kind of brutal caste feudal system in India. And so what I experienced in my family of a lineage of angry men, and he experienced a hundredfold. I mean, it was a really brutal time and area to grow up in, and poverty and everything. And there was actually within the family, the treatment of women was terrible. And there were actually murders of women who were, I don't remember what the reason was, but it was something that was suppressed and buried and put away. And Raj told this incredible story about how he called all of his family together to talk about the atrocities that were committed by his family and acknowledging all of the loss and the pain that happened in a group of maybe 70 people in his family and what the path forward might look like as a family. So I'm in touch with just like how courageous it is, but also how powerful it is to have maybe ceremony would be one way to put it, or just some sort of congregation and healing
Yeah.
spaces for this to be addressed. So I think those are pertinent examples to talk about what you're speaking to here. And now I would love to hear you keep going on like why this is so important to you and how you look at your own
Yeah.
healing, Germany's healing, the US healing.
Yeah. I think the core, I'll start with like one of the, I think, core leadership strategies that is often undervalued, which is the strategy of acknowledgement. Like I think, as coaches and psychologists often learn that in their training, that sort of, acknowledging people's reality, people's feelings, people's narratives can be a really powerful tool to like open up a new process, to heal, to feel seen, to not kind of reenact the same cycles of like being like hurt, traumatized, gaslit, whatever it is. And I don't think we generally acknowledge enough. And I think sort of when we look at why is it even important to study the past and to learn about the past, I think you can make the argument around like, well, so that we can prevent something like that in the future from happening. But I think another piece is because the constant process of the work of acknowledgement is also kind of a microdose of healing. And it's not that one acknowledgement, heals it all for all time. But I think sort of the collective practice of, acknowledging and being present with past is, has a potentially healing function. When we had our retreat last week, my firm KONU had a retreat last week in Germany, and our members of the Israel office were joining as well. And that retreat was like, in Germany, it was a few miles away from the Polish border, where like, in Poland, Germany committed like a lot of their atrocities, a lot of the concentration and termination camps were in kind of not on German territory, but kind of in the east. And so when I opened, I was just, in a sentence or two acknowledging that piece, and sort of, one of my Israeli colleagues came to me afterwards and said, like, I didn't even know that I needed this. I've been to Germany many times. I love Berlin. I love working with my German colleagues. Like, I'm fine. And like, thank you. It was really meaningful for you to acknowledge that. And I think that's all. And I think that sort of having a practice of acknowledgement or collective memorialization is an important practice. And I think, we privileged, why, or kind of folks that have the oppressor part in our ancestry, sometimes can feel fragile, anxious, awkward around that. And I think and that's why we avoid it, but that's exactly where the work is. And so I think what I find interesting is when I look at I think that's why it's important. And then when I look at kind of the of practice, how did we come to this? Like even coming to a place where we can acknowledge the facts, the pain, the hurt, the atrocities, the crimes, all of that stuff. Like even getting to there is a long pathway because there's tons of losses involved and relationships, right? So I can walk you a little bit through kind of what happened in Germany, which in a way is took a long time and is fascinating to watch. You have this like World War II, the Nazis come into power, the 33 democratically elected, just as a reminder for our American audience here, democratically elected by the system to then dismantle the system, and supported by some of the other parties as well, by some of the the Nazis only got like with the parliamentary system they only got in the 30% or so, but because other parties built a coalition with them, they basically put them into power, right? And the I think the narrative, and often the misunderstood narrative, is that everything the Nazis did was like just like pure coercion, like speaking up against them and you would be shot, kind of, and that's why everybody complied, which may be true at some parts, but like we forget that there was an authorizing environment. They got elected into power, and the first few years they like kind of tested the boundaries of that authorizing environment, like the concentration camp and the extermination camps and all of the most horrible stuff happened in the past few years. The early, I mean, they hosted the Olympics in 36. The war only started in 39, but like up until then there was like ongoing cross violations and kind of sort of getting rid of sort of institutional practices and beginning to codify laws of like who is pure and Aryan and who's not, and public expressions of shame that Aryan Germans participated in and authorized through their participation, through their presence, through their taking photographs or showing up or applauding or whatever, that then laid the ground for like further work. And the reason why I think why this is so important to know is like that then suddenly gets into this question of like how could this have happened? It's not just a few sort of evil Nazis that were there, but they were in an authorizing environment that we were all part of. And we don't know, I don't know, as the German who is like the grandchild of that generation, how I would have reacted if that had happened in my neighborhood. Would I have been the only one who showed up and said, like, I protest and I don't join in the Hitler salute and I don't, right? Like that is that big question I think we're sitting with. And so, you fast forward and wake up kind of in the Germany of like 46, 47 in ruins, kind of, lost the war. You're like, certainly a lot of pain to like everyday Germans has happened as well in that war. My grandparents' house got bombed by a bomb, so their house is literally in ruins. And so their focus, like as a lot of folks focus, like in that time in Germany, was like, how do we rebuild this country? And literally like rebuilding the houses, the streets, the infrastructure, the economy. How do we get like the prisoners of war back? How do we? Where's my brother? Where's my father? Like, so okay, so in that environment, how do you then begin? When do you begin to deal with the past? So certainly not in the 50s. We see those first moves only like later in the 60s show up and kind of, and I find those moves that we see very interesting because Germany has then had an economic boom. Suddenly, like the bellies were getting a little bit bigger and people were starting to drive cars and like the Volkswagen was thriving and, all of that stuff. So at what point does somebody show up, practice leadership and say like, wait a moment, can we pause everybody? Like there's like an elephant in the room we all need to address. And I think it is these moments of leadership that I don't think we study enough and we talk a lot enough about, because I think these moments of leadership are the type of leadership that we need in the US and right now. So if it's okay, I'll just share two or three with you, and then
Yeah.
we'll go into the conversation. So because we're currently talking so much about the court system in many countries. In the US, we've been talking a lot about the courts. In Israel, we're talking a lot about the courts at the moment. Um, One of the most significant moves of leadership that has enabled Germany to confront its past was in the legal system, in the court system. It was a district attorney who had the guts to put basically Auschwitz murders in front of a, then, Western German court in the late 60s, like, over 20 years later. And it was unheard of. And because many of his colleagues, had been part of the system, he got a lot of threats, death threats, got marginalized. His name was Fritz Bauer. There's like two beautiful movies made about him that are also available in English. I highly recommend to watch. But he really had the guts to bring to start, Germans were very meticulous kind of bureaucrats. A lot of it's documented, and he had the guts to start having trials. And the interesting thing, this is coming back to sort of acknowledgement education. Like you can ask yourself, like I think there was like a couple of hundred, maybe 800, 900 people tried in the end. Like if you compare that to the scope of like 6 million murdered Jews, like what does that it's like it's impossible to compare. But what it did was it provided a little bit of justice, but it provided acknowledgments, and in particular, it provided like a place where Germans began to confront this difficult past. Like when you ask my parents, where did you learn about Auschwitz? It was like in the late 60s from the newspapers of the Auschwitz trials. Like before that, nobody would talk about the Holocaust at all. So in a way, there's this like attorney who's running a case, but actually this is education, right? And I think that's that's why I call this leadership, because he's doing his like lawyer work, he's doing his attorney work, but like it's actually, I think it's leadership work in the sense of it provides the platform for us to learn and to hear about it. He was the guy who like leaked. Like he also wanted to bring like some of the biggest biggest names of the Eichmanns and Mengeles in front of the court, some of the kind of the biggest criminals, and that was too hot. The police wouldn't even collaborate with him, so he leaked that to the Mossad, and like finally Eichmann was tried in Israel. So and then like another group of leadership moves that we saw then is like he was very hated. People didn't like him, didn't like this district attorney. But then what happened was that a lot of the people in the streets, like the student protests in the late 60s that also happened in Germany, a lot of students of humanities and kind of social sciences, they would partner with him, like this kind of old district attorney guy, and would say like he became a little bit of a hero for them. And so that's where sort of activism, joined in. And then the interesting thing is many of these students then became teachers in the 70s and 80s. And those were the people who taught me in school about history. And then we would, and were involved, or the historians were involved in memorialization. Then that's when we see in the 70s and 80s and 90s kind of actually the memorials kicking up in Germany and the local studies. And like in my school, we visited kind of the concentration camp memorial site and like studied about local Jewish life in my hometown and all of that stuff. But like it required a lot of leadership from these former activists who then turned teachers, who then in the teachers taught stuff that wasn't in the curriculum. They fought for the stuff to be in the curriculum. And I think that is so relevant because at the moment we have this massive debate in the US around like education and what do we talk about in education and what do we teach and all of that stuff. That was what required tons of leadership from people on the field who say like push forward and say like we need to confront the history. That's where a lot of the leadership happened. And then only then in the late 80s and 90s. So like again a few decades later when it became kind of common practice for like German senior politicians, authorities to like acknowledge the past. Like it was the German president in sort of, I think, 85, 40th anniversary of the end of World War II, for the first time said like the end of World War II was a day, his name was Richard von Weizsäcker, was the end of World War II was a day of liberation, not of defeat. Like but that was 40 years later, right? So you see that whole journey. And often we look at the most senior people, the leaders that need to lead us, but like that type of leadership often is happening in all other kinds of areas. And that I find fascinating. If I zoom forward into sort of our present day, like I think that's where we need to encourage leadership and the work to happen to confront the past. All right. That was a long journey. So I'm going to pause now and curious to hear resonances, reactions, reflections from you.
Yeah. Oh my God, Michael. There's so many things. I'll do my best to pull on a few different threads and see if there's a question on the other end of it. So, well, one curiosity, just plant this in your brain, is I would love to hear about those two movies. You mentioned two movies, and I would love maybe after this conversation, I can remind you to send me links to that. I'm struck by something that I am feeling into right now is the power of acknowledgement in as almost a practice in daily life. And one thing that was coming up for me as you kept referring to acknowledgement is, I mean, in a work setting, or if we went around our family dinner table, what if we really took the time to check in with each other and see what's going on with each person? Like, what are you really bringing to this meeting or to this meal right now? And acknowledging what is happening for every person. That feels like it could have this ripple effect and help people really feel like they're safe to be acknowledged and to show up as themselves. And speaking of ripple effect, I'm very touched by the way that one courageous act, one courageous leader can have a ripple effect that they might not see, they might not quote unquote see the benefits of their action, but it allows for this seismic shift to happen. And I think one of the really interesting components of what you do at KONU, which for people who speak the language won't be too much of a revelation, but one of the really amazing components of what you do at KONU is you honor the leader in every single person that is part of an organization, right? Leadership is not title. You're the CEO of KONU, but every single person has the capability of being a leader. And so this courageous man was a leader, not because of the title that he had or the status that he had, but because there was some truth that he wanted to speak. There was something that mattered to him that he showed up courageously and expressed. And I'm wondering, like, one question I was sitting with was how would you explain the importance of this to people in the business world? But I think that you've already really started to massage that into your answers here. I would just love to hear you riff a little bit on how you would define leadership. Like, I think there's a really big misconception that, like I said,
Yeah,
leader is title.
the
And
leader.
what does
Yeah, yeah.
leadership mean to you?
Um, so the practice of leadership is a very young discipline and much younger than many other disciplines. Like if you journeyed back in history a few decades, like leadership wasn't taught anywhere. And so even when we teach it now, I like one of my I teach a class at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I always joke two professors of leadership would rather share the same toothbrush than the same definition of leadership. And it speaks to how young this discipline is. Like every single book of leadership has their own definition. And like if you went to economists, like they might be fighting about things, but they're not fighting around what supply means or what demand means, or other worlds. Like usually a discipline is defined by a shared set of like assumptions and vocabulary. And the practice of the discipline of leadership really doesn't have that. Like there's all of these different definitions of leadership and confusions. And so there's the confuse there's like and our fantasies, like the sort of the heroic assumption of the one leader, the savior who like does it all, or the charisma, and all of these, like the title, the lead, like all of that stuff that I think is not very useful. And it's sort of what I've been leaning on, kind of all of the different frameworks that are out there, is Ron Heifetz's leadership framework that is just so beautiful at offering a few really thorough distinctions that help us like be much more nuanced as this practice is evolving. And one of those distinctions is that he says, like, you know there is a difference between the role that you have in an organization or in a group. We call that role authority. You are authorized as the CEO, you are authorized as the president. You are also maybe informally authorized as the helper or supporter or peacemaker. Like, that's a role, right? We call that formal authority and informal authority. But then there is the act, the practice of leadership. It's a verb. It's not a role that you hold, that you constantly do, but there are moments. Today you may make that move, but tomorrow you may not make a move. And today Lyndon B. Johnson Heifetz talks, like, has all of these historic studies in his book. And like one chapter, he talks about like all of these like fascinating leadership moves that Lyndon B. Johnson made about the civil rights movement. And then the next chapter, you see how Lyndon B. Johnson like really screws us up around Vietnam. And like, is he a leader? Is he not a leader? Well, it doesn't matter. He is the president. That's his role. And he had moments when he practiced really beautiful leadership that led to progress, and then moments when he misled people, and when it created the opposite. So how do we see good leadership? In the results. We see this as our people making progress on the tough, complex challenges of their time. It's learning happening, and progress, learning, thriving happening. That is kind of the measurement of leadership. And when I tie that back to kind of that question around kind of German democracy and civil society and diversity and inclusion, is like, is Germany in a better place now than it was in the past? And has learning been happened? Is there more resilience, more robustness? I would say yes, but like that is not a single quote unquote leader who got us there, but like that is many, many moves, many acts of leadership. Some of them we saw, like by Fritz Bauer, the district attorney, and some of these teachers, but many of these moves also are happening day to day in families, with parents having conversations with their kids and with each other, and fighting and like exploring these nuances. So I think that is what we mean by leadership as possible, from any chair. When we are working in our organization, made a big effort, or are in the journey of making a big effort and becoming more diverse and equitable as an organization, like this is not one mission statement or one conversation. This is ongoing work. And every single move of this, every single learning move that makes us a little bit better, like that is leadership work.
Mm-hmm. Could you speak a little bit? I mean, so I actually wanted to connect one other dot that I think is important as it pertains to understanding leadership and why we do things that we do. Something that seemed baked into your explanation of Germany's history was the way that systems really heavily influence the way that we operate, right?
Yeah.
And I think that we take that for granted. I know that I have taken it for granted. Like, America is hyper individualistic. We like to take responsibility for the way that we act. And also, it's important to note that systems really play a big role. Like, we operate in capitalism, we operate in systems that favor men, patriarchy. We have a history of colonialization. So I wanted to bring that into our awareness too. And the question, which has nothing to do with that, I just wanted to share the reflection, is like, how do you look at these really big challenges? What does the work look like so that you're able to you're not making a mission statement about race and climate change. It's something that you're actively looking at. What does that look like for KONU?
Yeah. So, I mean, KONU's work is to develop change agents, right, for these big systemic challenges out there. It's a very ambitious kind of purpose statement, if you want. Um, but when I think about the practice of leadership, like these there are challenges out there in the world that are complex in nature, and we don't know the answers for that yet. We don't know how to solve climate change. Otherwise, we would have solved that. We don't know how to solve questions around equity or how to heal some of these historic wounds. Um, we don't know how to bring peace in certain areas in the world. We don't know how to transform our economy in a way that more people can thrive and participate. We have so many complex, the ocean stuff, the pollution. Like there's so many pieces that we don't know the answers to, and we would call them complex or wicked or adaptive. I would call them adaptive challenges that require learning. So how can we make progress on them, right? Very often we look at experts and we say like, hey, let's look at the expert and solve it. But like the expert can't solve a challenge that we don't know how to solve. The expert can solve a technical challenge that requires expertise, but they can't solve a challenge that requires learning. So then we need to figure out how do we organize learning. And so the interesting thing there is that's then where all of our agency sets in, because many of these complex challenges have manifestations at whichever level of the system that you're operating in. When you are working for the UN and figure out what the response to climate change in Bangladesh is, as they're kind of just on the cusp of graduating from kind of low income country to middle income country, and what that means to their economy and like climate change policy, like that's the level of a system that the government and the UN is operating on, right? That is very different from figuring out what do we do about climate change if I am an organization with 15 people that is flying a lot, like KONU is, or if I'm a organization with 2,000 people that so each part of the system, or if I'm a family system that is figuring out, well, what are we going to do for our next vacation, or are we putting solar panels on our roof, or how are we educating our children around the climate, and are we going skiing next winter? Like, I think each of these challenges, I'm talking about climate now, but like if you think about sort of diversity, equity, inclusion as another challenge, has manifestations at levels, as systemic levels, macro, meso, micro, in which we have some agency. Maybe our team at the lowest level, our family, ourselves. It may be our organization, our community, our neighborhood, or it may be for some people, the nation, and then you go on the streets or you become an elected official. And the question is, how are you working that challenge at that level? And I think the mistake we often make is that we are not finding the right level. So when we work with change agents, we look at what is the level of the system that you have some agency over. That doesn't mean you need to have full agency, right? You don't need to be in charge of that team that is trying to figure out how do we, for example, are more inclusive of voices around the table. You don't need to be in charge of that. You can actually be just a participant and say like, hey, we haven't heard from this participant yet. I'd love to bring their voice in. But you need to be at the table, right? You can't, So I think that's an interesting question. I just as much as the local teachers in the German case example in my hometown were working a piece of how do we deal with the past in Germany, a piece of the puzzle. We're all working in our different roles, a piece of the puzzle of these global challenges. And a common form of work avoidance of how we deal with our overwhelm is like look back and say like, I can't do anything about this. Like this is for the politicians, or this is for the seat. But the problem is when you go to their offices, I coach a bunch of CEOs, like they don't know what to do either. They're overwhelmed with it as well. They can't say it as loudly because they were hired to solve the problems, but the nature of the problems is such that they require learning. And so the learning needs to be organized. And like that's where sort of an education mindset helps. And the learning needs to be organized at the level of a system that you have some influence over.
Mm. Oh, there's so much here. Well, one thing that I would love to hear your thoughts on is just the way that you look at education. Like there is a lot of tension around education system, whether it's for children who are going through traditional schooling, in what a lot of people would say is an outdated way of teaching and learning. It usually makes for, this is my projection, it makes for people who are compliant workers but who aren't able to really, like, haven't learned the skills around sitting with adaptive challenges, things that don't have an answer. We're really good. We are conditioned really well to problem solve and find technical problems to work on. And our education system, it seems to lack a lot around emotional awareness, relational awareness. Uh, yeah, but I think that I've pointed out a lot of the different things that are interesting to me. And you're an educator, so how do you look at ways that if we were to totally reinvent the education system so that folks were more equipped to both do technical things are important. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but also are able to hold these adaptive challenges that are important. If we don't address climate change at some point, that will be the termination of us.
That's a big question. So first of all, like I'm not educated in the US and have done very little work in the US education
Right.
system. I'm only beginning to learn more and more about it and kind of contrast and compare some of the differences of my experience in the German education system, where I have, as an educator and somebody who was in the German charter school movement, I have some experience. So I may not be the best to kind of at the best position to contrast and compare and evaluate. Maybe what I can bring is the lens of the experiential educator, who that I've been and identify as, and I think that holds true for both adults and for children, which is people learn really well when there is a problem in front of them that waits to be solved. And that is a problem that is just hard enough. So it's a little bit outside our competence of knowing how to solve it, but it's not overwhelming. It's not totally overwhelming. It's just outside that frontier. And if it's a problem that is relevant to us, like it's often like one of the reasons, like, some education doesn't feel relevant for us. It's like we're learning things that we don't know what their relevance is. So somehow the work of educators is to help people who are learning to understand, to frame the reason why this is a worthwhile challenge to engage with. And then engage with it, and then try to figure that out. And I think if these two things are happening, if the problem is scoped in a way that it's not too easy, it's not too hard, it pushes us a little bit into that learning zone, and if it feels relevant, it feels like that is something I want to engage with right now, I think then beautiful learning happens. And so I often think that's the role of the educator, kind of the curation and scoping of the challenges, of the problems, and then the framing, invitation into the problem space, and then supporting the process and helping folks, reflect and understand, like, what is it that we're learning here? How do we address this? How did we solve this? And this may be true for young children that are, entering a physics challenge, a problem, as much as adults who are trying to engage with a problem that is outside their zone of competence in the management or organizational space.
What do you think is important about, like, personal development? It can have a lot of different flavors. And like what would you say is important about personal development, human development, in terms of how we can address these really big, like, helping people become change agents, KONU's mission? I imagine that is making eye contact with change agents to become change agents for things around race, climate change, etc.
Yeah.
And so, what would you say is important about development? Why is it important that we do our own work so that we can be change agents?
There's different developmental tasks or different developmental capabilities um, that are needed for different types of engaging with complex work. I'll give you 2 or 3 examples. The work of naming a harsh reality, the activist work of like, look, there is an elephant in the room we're not addressing, like, in the German case example, or in, the example of many Fridays for Future folks that are helping us address the climate emergency and saying like, this is not a climate change challenge, this is a climate crisis, an emergency, right? That work, that activist work requires a deep understanding of courage, of the readiness to take risks, and like there's a reason why that is often kind of a youth movement, right? That is a kind of a developmental reality that often happens in young people. But then there's almost a second phase of that where we may have a phase in which we are trying to fit in, where we're trying to find our role in society, where we're trying to belong, where we're trying to and we may be anxious around not fitting in, around not belonging, around not performing well enough, and that prevents us from being courageous, from speaking up. So okay, then we may need to learn again or relearn to get in touch again with that sort of own voice, my own perspective, my own stance, and kind of that kind of almost pendulum between like, here's an injustice, but I also want to belong, but like there's also important work to do. Like that, we would call that is a developmental journey, not just a skill set, like different stages of maturity of adulthood are engaging different with that challenge. I'll give you a second example. There's a real another leadership opportunity is holding to people in a room together, including people of difference, and helping them understand why it's important to be in a room together. Now, if you're overly conflict averse, we talked about that in our beginning of our conversation. Often people think about conflict aversion as a character trait. I don't think it's true. I think this is a developmental opportunity. Like we all have had certain areas in our lives and certain developmental, stages where the conflict aversion was actually a necessary reality that protected us, at least you and me, in our biography. But I think that's true for many people. As we adults, as we grow older, we find that, the big bad thing that may happen if somebody gets angry is actually not that big and bad. All that happens is like they get angry because we are adults ourselves. We can hold ourselves. We're fine. We're even fine with another adult who freaks out. We're like, okay, calm down. Let's engage again. We're good again. Right. But like that is a developmental capacity, that is self-development that we develop over time, sometimes in our 30s, sometimes in my case, in my early 40s. But that's a core capability to hold a room and to allow a room to have a really juicy, productive conflict with each other. And not for you as the facilitator or the convener or the authority or whoever you are in the room to like at the earliest beginning of some conflict emerging to shut it down and say like, hey, back to harmony, let's take this offline, let's set up a group, let's call in consultants, let's do it's not that bad of a problem, we're all good, we're all happy, we love each other. All of these avoidance tactics that we constantly do, like that is a developmental capacity. We're like really like, okay, let's get in touch with what would be so bad about like the heat going a little bit higher here, because that's actually where some of the juice is. And so anyways, there's more of these areas, but like that's where the personal development, it's nice to develop and to learn more about yourself, but like that the capability of these skills around conflict and heat the capability around like provocation and activism and creativity and voice. Like these are just two areas of you know where I see people grow tremendously within a coaching journey or within a developmental setting, either therapy, a coaching journey, or a program, a leadership development program, where they're suddenly like, holy moly, show up very differently after like a few months of work and suddenly speak up or suddenly like hold steady and like not cool the room down, and that's beautiful to see.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm hearing, one of the simple ways to put this maybe is that if you build the capacity for more options to happen, that you're not averse to more to so many things, then there's just more availability for other, productive ways of emergence, right? Like that's kind of long and short of what I'm hearing.
Beautiful, beautiful. More options. Having more options in your toolbox has is never a bad idea
No.
because then you have much more nuanced opportunities and you can course correct. If you feel like, oh, this path doesn't really work, well, let's try this one.
Hmm. Hmm. So I'm meandering a little bit here, but I think there's so many cool aspects to your story. And one way I'm wondering, I guess this might be a two-parter. I'm wondering what woke you up to the importance of doing this work, because for a lot of my life, I have been avoidant. And I don't know, if you asked me the same question, I would have to reflect a little bit. Like, what woke me up to step into this line of work? And maybe the second part of this question that I want to throw your way is I'm always in touch with the power of storytelling. And when you were younger, I didn't watch the show, but you watched Star Trek. And it seems like Star Trek spoke to you. It woke something up in you. And I don't know if these two things are connected, but you can take this and run with it in any way you would like. So I guess the two-parter is, I'm curious what impact Star Trek had on you. And I'm curious what woke you up to the level of importance of this work.
Now I'm curious. You said like I don't know what to like. Tell me a little bit more what you mean by waking up. It's such an
Yeah.
interesting word choice.
Yeah. Do you want
And
me to?
and maybe as you explain that, maybe there is something that comes up for you as you get in touch with what woke you up.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that for a while, I definitely looked at my life as I just have to. It's interesting because in a lot of ways, I wasn't taking care of myself because I was living some other prescribed life that didn't feel like it was mine. But I also looked at responsibility as something that belonged out there, but not with me. Like that, I didn't have the agency to show up as a leader, given that I was only an associate at my first job. And I didn't have the agency to affect climate change. I'm just one in a node of a massive network of people. And yeah, so when I say waking up, I think that over time, there gradually was a shift in my life where I have started to take more responsibility. Like in a kind of joking way, sometimes when it's very deadly serious, but in a lighthearted way, I will walk with my wife outside, and if there's a piece of trash on the ground, I lean down, pick it up, and say, "Not on my planet," and I throw that in the garbage. And I never would have done that in the past. So it's not to say that wearing a cape and I'm a superhero. It's just like this being alive on this planet and supporting this planet is really important to me. And there are a few things that contributed to that, but I would describe waking up as feeling like there are, what you said, there's problems, there's diagnostics that we can use to assess how we can have an effect. And I'm constantly scanning for what's the level of effect that I can have on this thing that I say is important to me, and how can I act on the thing that I say is important to me, not just say it in here for some moral high ground.
Beautiful, beautiful. Um, for me, I think my wake up moment is around orchestrating learning. I have been growing up so frustrated with my primary care takers' inabilities to learn and adjust. It was just like I've been trying so hard to like explain to mommy what daddy means, to explain to daddy what mommy means. And it's just like, it was like, and and one of my kind of sanctuaries was my dancing. I was a rock and roll dancer as a teenager and in my 20s. And um I I kind of thought it was an escape, but it was also joy, and I just really loved. And I learned early how to learn how I would make progress if I kind of continued with a regular practice. And I for some reason, and I don't know why, I decided as a 15-year-old to start coaching kind of the younger kids, the 12-year-olds. And I even did like a certificate, and they let me like coach like in the, I don't know, like today with liability and like stuff would be like, but like I was like a 15-year-old with like 12-year-olds with a key and like hosting the sessions, just me, no adults. That was me. There's videos. I have videos of this. Fascinating, right? But like, so, 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 and very early in my teaching career, that's when I started teaching at 15. Very early in my teaching career, I remember this moment when I was working with a young couple. They may not even have been 12, they may have been like 9 or 10. And for the life of it, they could not dance to the rhythm of the music. They would have what I call an autonomous, today I would call it an autonomous music understanding. Like, and they would just like the music would roll in their rhythm, and they would just dance like as if they were in a different planet hearing something else. And it was just like it would not align with the music. And I was like sitting with that challenge around, how do I teach these kids how to like hear the rhythm and dance to the rhythm? And it took me like a week or 2 or 3, and I was like, this is so fascinating to me because I couldn't even not dance in the rhythm. I tried to do that, but like once you hear the rhythm, you can't unhear it. It's like the hardest thing in the world to dance not to the rhythm when you have the rhythm. So I tried all kinds of things. And then there was this moment when I switched off the music and I asked them to sing to their dancing, sing and count. We played with count, we started with clapping, we counting and singing, all these things, different things. And when they would clap and count and snap and sing to their own dancing, was all aligned. It was all aligned. So they were dancing to a rhythm, to their singing. Then I switched on the music and I said, like, okay, like, do you hear the song, sing along? And they were listening to the song and hearing along. And then I would like switch it on and ask them to like sing along and hear the song and sing along and dance along. And bam, they were dancing to the music in the rhythm in line. And from that moment, they could never unhear it. They would always be in the rhythm. It was just like this moment where this light bulb got on. And I think like looking at it like back now, I haven't thought about this story for a long time, but looking at it now, I'm just like, I don't think they were listening to the music before. I don't think they were hearing the music. I don't think they were like in touch with the rhythm. And the singing and the counting and the clapping got them in touch with like the listening and the perception of it. And the wake up moment there was like, I still remember in that moment kind of the frustration of like, how do I teach somebody how to dance in the rhythm, to hear the rhythm? And then the moment when it clicked for them, it was like almost a holy moment, a sacred moment where I'm just like, wow. And I knew at that moment they would never go back. And that was the first learning light bulb moment that I saw. And I think ever since then I've been like obsessed with like finding light bulb moments for people and caring about like learning is possible and learning is beautiful and it's magical and it's gorgeous. And how can I generate context where people are like see something differently that they can't unsee anymore. And that's the type of learning I'm curious about. So kind of you were asking for wake up, but like there was the hope. I think the hope was there, like, wow, I can actually help orchestrate learn. They don't always have but like I can orchestrate learning and there's the hope that it clicks.
That's a beautiful story, and in a lot of ways it's a metaphor for, like a lot of ways I think when we start to get into development work, we're dancing to a rhythm that we can't even hear. And then if you can help someone align to like, here's some other steps that can help you listen to the music. I would, it's akin to finding alignment. Oh,
Yeah.
like for me, my somatic development has been, I couldn't possibly have listened to the cues that my body was giving me because I had no literacy in it. And once someone gave me a couple of different cues that I could look for, it's something now that I routinely check in with in myself. And so it actually is a beautiful metaphor for the dance of life, if you will, that we're all kind of in some ways we would probably get lost and are dancing to some beat that we can't even follow. And then if we help someone find that this is one way to get alignment with the beat, that's such a beautiful moment. So I'm really loving that metaphor. And yeah, if there's anything else that comes up for you around that, I'm happy to listen to it. But I also am curious to hear around. I did bring up Star Trek, and I think that storytelling and pop culture can be
Yeah.
really uh, powerful portals into, stories can just evoke a lot that maybe
Yeah.
everyday life doesn't. So what did Star
Yeah.
Trek evoke for you?
I'm a big Trekkie. I mean, like, this is these the past few years, Trek has had a huge revival with like a bunch of new shows, and like I'm like, ready to go home and watch the new show that just came out today. And it's just such the child in me is just like the heart is shining. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s, a little bit with Captain Kirk and kind of the original Star Trek, but really with Next Generation, Jean-Luc Picard. Deep Space Nine was lovely, and Voyager, like those three shows and the feature movies. And and the interesting thing is when we think about how I think how people like the younger generation, many of them relate to Harry Potter as kind of sacred text, and like kind of go back and back and back, and I can go back and back and back to Star Trek over and over again. And I think one of the beautiful things of Star Trek from the very first moment, even in the 60s, is kind of this hopeful vision of the future, and including this really nuanced idea of diversity and infinite kind of possibilities that can happen with diversity. Like, I mean, Star Trek has been some of the pioneers around, like, I mean, the first interracial kiss on
Hmm.
television is like William Shatner and Nichols, who are on Captain Kirk. We have, like, people always say like, oh, we don't have any people of color in leading roles in TV shows, no representation. I mean, look at Deep Space Nine from the 90s, like Avery Brooks, a really inspiring Black actor as a single dad with his kind of 10-year-old son. You have him in this like difficult, like commanding post at the space station, but also you see the family dynamic play out, like the mom got killed in an accident, or in a war. So it was this beautiful portrayal, like really three-dimensional, very like in the 90s. And so you see that over and over again around like different areas that Star Trek has been really like a little bit ahead of its time. But and so for me, growing up, this difficult family system, this closeted gay kid, often really feeling like kind of the outsider and like lonely and all of that stuff, that the world of Star Trek, where like there was these creatures, these different planets, the wrestling with like multiple perspectives and kind of the logic of each of their own stories and their norms and how they clash with each other, but also how they get resolved with each other, was just like such an hopeful inspiration to see. And if I may say, sort of today, kind of looking back at it, like so different from so many other narratives that we see that are very simplistic, kind of, if you like, sorry, Star Wars fans out there, but like a Star Wars always feels to me like sort of good versus evil, kind of a medieval battle in space, just happens to be in space. But like the Star Trek has like this beautiful nuance around like multiple narratives and options, and ways to resolve like those tensions that come from that, and this immense hopefulness moving forward.
Hmm. So interestingly put, and there's a lot of airtime is given to the hero's journey, and I think that there's definitely space for hero's journey, like Star Wars type of movies where there's one hero, one protagonist that
Yeah.
we're rooting for. But I love that you're bringing in the kind of complexity and nuance that is clearly a through line in your work and in your life. So, Michael, is there anything that we haven't spoken about so far today that you would like to bring into the conversation? And if not, I have just a couple more questions for you.
Let's go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So these might be a little bit lighter. We've talked about some really big things. I've asked some big questions. These might be a little simpler for you. So you could start to turn the heat down. What's an ordinary everyday moment that brings you great joy?
In the morning when I put the boiling water on my oatmeal and the smell that comes up as the flakes are like slowly like sort of disintegrating in that hot water and like that I really enjoy that moment.
Hmm. You brought up dance. This might be the answer, like acrobatic dance. Is there, what other hobbies or things are you doing for fun, or how do you look at play in your life?
So I've been doing a lot of yoga, but like the real playful stuff is I've started a handstand practice and even treated myself with a handstand coach who is really impressive kind of Instagram kind of celebrity with handstands. We can add his file link in the show notes. Maybe his name's
Sure.
Ulrich. Ulrich. And he has this beautiful program where he like gives you uh, a training plan, and you you film yourself with your phone, and then he gives you feedback once a week. And I've been like I had this assumption that, oh my God, I'm in my 40s now. Handstand is out of my reach. And I'm just like, you know what, I'm going to try it. And I'm like, from not even being able to stand free to like my now record. I mean, it's not persistent, but like last week I got 30 seconds freestanding handstand and it was amazing. So that's kind of my current really like weird hobby is like handstanding and like learning how to find balance in handstand.
I love it. Is there something that you're actively working on learning in your life right now?
On learning or
Unlearning,
unlearning?
unlearning,
Unlearning.
UN.
UN, unlearning. Hold yeah. I thought these were lighter questions.
This one's, I guess, not as light.
Yeah. Um, I mean, the big theme for me is like we haven't talked much about kind of my organizational journey, but like, I founded my firm in 9 years ago by myself and with my co-founder Tim O'Brien, but it was mainly the two of us, and now we're like almost 20 people, and so I am really at that stage where I'm unlearning kind of the micro management and the control and the quality elements that have really helped me succeed in the early years, and now really allowing people to find their own measures of quality and beauty and creativity, and so that's going well on some days, and on other days I regress and jump in and fix it all, and so letting go of my control tendencies, I think is the unlearning journey that I have been on recently.
Mhm. Okay, so just two more for you. One is if there's a couple of books that you'd recommend as they pertain to this conversation that we've had so far. Yeah, I'd love
Yeah.
to always leave my listeners with a couple of books.
So I think, if you're interested about the history stuff, I think the best one is Caste by Isabella Wilkes. It's like, a very widely known book. And the beauty of that book is it compares kind of Germany, India, and the US, what she calls caste systems.
Mhm.
And just the categories of caste are different. In German, it's like, Aryan and Jewish. In Indian, it's the caste, and in the US, it's like mainly around race. the sort of the caste system around race, but like the 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 parallels and comparisons she draws are really amazing, including some of the implications for leadership work. So I love that book. I think it's really really powerful. Hi Fitz. And my favorite book is actually the oldest one, Leadership Without Easy Answers. It's also the densest one. It's the book that I reread in my podcast on the balcony. But it's really beautiful because it just has a lot of rigor in the stories, in the framework. So that is really wonderful. Maybe those two.
Okay. So it's Caste by Isabella Wilkins and Leadership Without Easy Answers by Ron Heifetz, right? Those are the two.
Correct.
Okay. All right. And I will definitely link, in addition to those and other resources, people that were mentioned in the conversation, I'll link to your podcast On the Balcony. I'll link to KONU. Are there other places that you would invite people to connect with you, or those are the two main ones?
Yeah, LinkedIn. Happy to reach, for folks to reach out on LinkedIn. But yeah.
Cool. I'll link to that as well. All right. And the final question, which actually also maybe I over promised and under delivered here. The final question is not a super softball toss. The podcast is called Mike's Search for Meaning, as you know, and I've collected almost 100 answers to this question. I would love to know, in your words, what it means to live a meaningful life.
To learn, to love, to play, to be free, to be in relationship.
Well, Michael, those are beautiful things, and as good an answer as any to that question. So I think you brought a little bit of all of those flavors into the conversation today, and we brought in play briefly at the end there, but it seems like it's actually a big part of your life as well. So I really appreciate you taking the time to have this wide-ranging conversation with me. I think they're all equal parts timely and also timeless. These are things that we can sit with for a really long time that are also really important right now. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing at KONU. I'm a big fan of you as a person now, as I've gotten to listen to other appearances that you've made and having this conversation we had today. It is not easy to address all of these different complexities. And I know that it's not a one-man show or one organization show, but it must not be easy for you as an organization at KONU to be helping other organizations confront these really thorny challenges. And you seem like you do it in a way that brings a certain level of levity and also addresses the urgency of all of these challenges. And I think that's a really important balance to strike. And I'm really glad that you're able to share some of your gifts with me today and with the audience. So thank you so much for being here.
Mike, thank you. Thank you for creating this space, your presence, your curiosity, your depth. It's been such a joy. Thank you.
And to anyone and everyone who's listening, I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day or evening. Maybe do a handstand for however many seconds you can, and take good care. Lots of love. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to Mike's Search for Meaning. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, share this episode with your friends, and leave a review. I look forward to seeing you next time, my friends. And until then, stay safe, stay well, and keep living with purpose. Peace.